In this video, we're going to be studying the different layers that are found in our skin, part of the integumentary system. Let's go ahead and start from the most superficial region. So we're going to have the topmost or superficial most layer of our skin. This is called the epidermis. So the epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. If you remember, one of the four major categories of tissue types found in the body. And specifically, it's made up of many layers of flattened cells. So they are going to be stratified squamous cells. And we're going to talk about this in much more detail in another video when we look at the different layers of the epidermis itself, but it's mainly composed of 4 to 5 layers. And again, we'll talk about this difference in another clip. It is also an avascular layer. And what this means is that it does not have its own blood supply. However, you'll see that it lies in very close proximity to capillary loops and blood vessels, but that is found in the layer below. Now let's move a little bit more deeply. And so our next layer that we're going to be discussing is what we call the dermis. So the dermis is located deep to the epidermis. And so both of those layers, the epidermis and the dermis, make up our skin. Another name for skin is the cutaneous layer. Or cutaneous membrane. And so this cutaneous membrane, or our skin, is made up of 2 layers, the epidermis as well as the dermis. Now the dermis itself is divided into 2 layers. So we have a more superficial layer, and this is going to be a very small or thin layer located immediately below the epidermis, and then another deeper and thicker layer. So let's go ahead and talk about the difference between these 2 layers. So I'm going to call them layer A and layer B of the dermis. Let's start with layer A. This is what we call the papillary layer. And as you can see, this is a very thin layer located immediately below the epidermis, but it's the superficial layer of the dermis. What you'll also notice is that we have these bump-like structures, and these are what we call dermal papilla. And so these dermal papilla are just interdigitating into the epidermis, and these are actually what form our fingerprints. So if you look at your palm and specifically your fingertips, you'll notice the ridges. These are formed or caused by the dermal papillae. Okay, so they're going to form fingerprints. And then finally, you'll also see that we have here a vascular layer. Because of the presence of capillary loops that you'll see right here, here, etc. Right? So blood vessels. So even though the epidermis is not really vascular, it comes in very close proximity with blood vessels, but these belong to the papillary layer. Next up, let's examine layer B. So layer B is going to be the reticular layer. And This is the deeper layer of the dermis. Right? And it consists of connective tissue, specifically collagen and elastic fibers. And this is what gives your skin strength. I will also add that the dermis, unlike the epidermis, is not made up of epithelial tissue. Instead, it is made up of connective tissue. Right? So it consists of capillaries, so blood vessels, collagen, elastic fibers, as well as dense, irregular connective tissue. Right? So all types of, or many types of connective tissue are found in the dermis, whereas the epidermis was only epithelial tissue. Finally, let's go ahead and identify a few more structures that you typically see associated with the dermis. So here I'm going to write structures labeled, and we're going to go ahead and label some structures that we will be identifying inside this reticular layer. The first thing that you probably see is this follicle right here extending a shaft, and this is the hair follicle. So you're going to have hair follicles in the dermis, and you're also going to have oil glands that send their secretions into the hair follicle. And so these oil glands are what we call sebaceous glands. Okay. Sebaceous or oil glands because they release oil, also known as sebum. Sebum is really important because it helps with moisturizing your skin, but also has a protective function. So it's actually also going to kill the bacteria on your cell surface or skin surface because it contains lysozyme, the enzyme that can kill bacteria. Another gland that you can see is what we call an eccrine gland or sweat gland. And what you're going to notice is that it has its pore that releases at the surface of the epidermis. Some additional structures that you can identify are some sensory receptors. And so here we have nervous structures such as sensory receptors to detect touch, pressure, vibration. And then we also have this structure right here that you're going to see attaching to the base of the hair follicle. This is actually a type of smooth muscle that we call erector pili muscle. And this muscle here is actually what's responsible for goosebumps. So when you are cold or you're shivering, contraction of these erector pili muscles are going to allow the hair to stand upright or become erect, and this is what's responsible for your goosebumps. So these are the structures that are associated with the dermis layer, specifically the reticular layer of the dermis. And so this is basically a summary of the two layers of your skin, the epidermis and the dermis, which comprise your cutaneous membrane. So, to wrap it up, let's just talk about the very small thin layer that you find underneath the dermis reticular layer. And so this is what we call the hypodermis, also known as the subcutaneous layer. Sub is a prefix for below or under, and cutaneous layer, you already know what this means. This refers to the cutaneous layer or the cutaneous membrane, which is your skin. So the hypodermis is not really part of your skin. It's not a skin layer. In fact, it's only found below the skin layer, hence the name subcutaneous. And this consists of some connective tissue, such as areolar connective tissue, as well as adipose, fatty tissue. Okay, so for example, these would be the adipocytes, where fat is stored underneath the skin.